We are here for the 11th session of the Climate Change for Development in Africa conference, which is a flagship of the Clean Dev Africa initiative, which is a joint initiative of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, which was mandated by African heads of states in 2007 to bring these institutions together to work together to support African countries to respond to climate change, because our heads of states at that time had recognized that the region was being heavily impacted by climate change. Now, when we talk about climate change impacts, it is a bit difficult for people to see, because people living in cities, for example, may not understand what it is that climate change is all about and how the impacts are really meaningful to real people. And I'm so glad to have had the opportunity during this session to meet a young lady called Miss Climate Kenya, and she narrated to us the human face of the impacts of climate change. When we do analysis, we talk about Africa is being impacted by climate change. It's losing 15% of GDP. Mozambique was hit by Cyclone Idai. They lost almost 15% of GDP and so on. But to meet a young person who comes from a Maasai community where Kenya has been undergoing consequential droughts for quite some time, and a small family with a small herd of cattle having no feed for the cattle, and the family is faced with, without the cattle, how are we going to survive? And they live in a political economy situation where you have big rich farmers also in the same area, and the poorer farmer is now forced to have to engineer illegal female genital mutilation to their daughters in order to sell them off to the richer farmers to have access to feed the cattle so that the family can survive. Now, this is a real message that drives home what the impacts of climate change are. But to ameliorate those impacts of climate change, we need financing. And financing is a big issue, and that is one of the big things that we're discussing here. Because we keep talking about climate finance. Since over 12 years ago, member states said developed countries will contribute 100 billion, which is a small number, which is a small amount of money in a way, but it has never happened. The amount of money that we need to implement the national determined contributions of African countries is close to 3 trillion. And we need at least about 1.5, 1.3 trillion of that amount to address adaptation, to build resilience, so that people like my young Miss Climate Kenya will not be able to be impacted by the impacts of climate change the way they have been. So in the discussions here, we're looking at how now can we have new ways of mobilizing climate finance, looking at also how Africa can mobilize its own resources, its own private sector. But most importantly, it speaks to the agenda that the Economic Commission for Africa is leading with the African Ministers of Finance and Planning, the African Union Commission, the African Development Bank, and the World Bank, to say that the multilateral development banks, remembering that the multilateral development banks were created to establish development, to promote development. Therefore, how do we, and this was done at a time which is very different from the circumstances now. So the ECA, through this high-level expert working group of the ministers and the institutions, is looking at how can we reform the global financial architecture so that these institutions can mobilize development finance that can support countries to respond to climate change. But equally, we need to also support countries with instruments. For example, taking out insurance, right? Like what the Africa Risk Capacity is doing, so that when the crops fail, people don't go hungry. When the crops fail, the droughts the rains don't fall, people eat. And so these are the kind of issues that we think will have to emerge from here to inform how we now take climate action going forward to ensure that we can adapt and build resilience, because we don't know what climate future is coming. Even though with the contributions that countries have said they will do in terms of emission reductions, it's still not enough to keep global warming to less than 1.5 globally. But in Africa, we are already at 1.5 degrees. So I think these issues about climate finance and how we mobilize resources to adapt to build resilience is extremely important. And we're working on this CCDA, which, by the way, is the official technical segment of the Africa Climate Summit, which for the first time is being convened by African heads of states based on the African Union Summit decision of 2019 that Africa now wants to convene at a head of state level a summit to begin to put together Africa's agenda on the global stage to address climate change issues on the continent. The conference will result in an output document that will feed into the summit, that would produce what is called the Nairobi Declaration and begin to set the stage as Africa goes to the climate summit in New York in September and later on in December to the COP28 in Dubai.